Hello and welcome. I'm Carolyn Grimminger with the Public Affairs Forum of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin. Our program's mission is to nourish the mind and spirit and serve social justice. Our forums occur on most Sundays at noon and are free and open to the public. We encourage you to attend. For more information about our Public Affairs Forum, you can go to our church website at www.austinuu.org. I'm excited that Judy Maggio is here with us today. Judy is an Emmy Award-winning broadcast journalist who feels fortunate that she spent her entire career here in Austin, the city she loves. She served as managing editor and weeknight anchor at both KVUE and KI. She covered most of the big stories in our community for the past 35 years and has interviewed luminaries such as Lady Bird Johnson, Willie Nelson, Ann Richards, and President George W. Bush. She chose to leave commercial television in 2014 and is now the editorial director for news and public affairs at KLRU Austin PBS, where she produces and anchors a monthly news magazine called Decibel. When she's not at work, she loves Austin's live music scene, dips in Barton Springs, and wearing flip-flops as much as possible. She's married to Meals on Wheels VP of Communication, Thad Rosenfeld. They have 2 grown daughters and a rescue beagle named Ruthie. Let's welcome Ms. Maggio.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for having me out here today. You know, as a journalist, I rarely discuss my political or personal religious beliefs, but I have to tell you that I do appreciate and applaud what I understand to be the Unitarian Universalist philosophy. As a child, we attended a Unitarian church in Houston for several years, and my parents always sought out congregations that fought for peace and justice and were active as positive change makers in the community, and I understand this church is a congregation just like that. So I'm thrilled to be here today. I want to start by saying, if it's possible to love a city the way you love a person, that's really the way I feel about Austin, Texas. In my 40-plus years here, I have watched it transform from a sleepy college town to a tech center that's now the 11th largest city in the nation. So despite the traffic, the affordability issues, and the inherent weirdness, or perhaps because of the inherent weirdness, I still have a very deep affection for this place we call home. And I'm incredibly proud and honored that so many people allowed me in their homes for 30-plus years to deliver the news on a regular basis for more than 3 decades, really. And I consider sharing those history-making moments and doing my best to tell the truth about those stories as really the biggest honor of my journalism profession. So today I want to take a look back at some of the highlights of my adventure in journalism. We're going to spend some time talking about my present position at KLRU, my dream job, really. And I want to look ahead a little bit to the ever-changing landscape of broadcast journalism and journalism as a whole. Well, it's fairly easy to look back when you've spent your entire adult life on TV. So I want to start with a little clip that I brought. I ran into a friend of mine who was a producer at KVUE back in the 80s, and she discovered this clip on an old VHS tape. We all remember VHS tapes, right? So the audio's not very good, but I just wanted to play it for you all. Just take a trip down memory lane. Remember my old co-anchor, Ron Oliveda?
It seems most anchor people stay anchored to their desks. Not her. She believes an anchor person has to get out and cover the news. She's been to hurricanes, offered exceptional reports from political conventions, and been first on the scene when the big news breaks. She's always fair and accurate and strives for the best our profession can be. It's a privilege to anchor the news with Judy Maggio, part of the team at 5 that's making a difference.
And it's just been a great ride. It's been a great ride. I can't complain at all. But as I've said, I feel incredibly blessed to have witnessed so many history-making events in all of our lives. I was asked to cover the Reagan-Gorbachev summit in 1986 in D.C., and I was 26 years old. If you're doing the math, just don't do the math. So President Reagan called on me to ask a question, and I was very nervous. I was sitting in the audience with Dan Rather and Steve Bell and some of the big journalists at the time. I think that Eric Severide might have been there. And so I was raising my hand going, Mr. President, and he called on me to ask a question. And of course, I was shaking in my boots. And I was so nervous, and I don't remember what I asked him, but I, was just trying to look very important. I'm 26 years old, I'm at a presidential news conference, looking very, professional. And at the end of it, I looked down at my notes, and it was just scribble. I took no notes at all. Thank goodness there was a photographer behind me recording the whole thing. I was on hand in the audience covering Ann Richards in 1988 when she made the famous silver spoon speech that eventually led her to the governor's mansion. In 1996, I was with Governor George Bush doing live shots in San Diego as he helped run the Republican convention, and then 4 years later, I covered him in Philadelphia as he accepted the party's nomination for president. I have spent time in the Oval Office and in the West Wing. I've covered 3 presidential inaugurations, including one when it was 17 degrees. I still don't know why they don't change things and not have the inauguration in January, because it's miserable. I was so cold that my mouth froze, literally. I was doing a live report and I couldn't talk anymore because my mouth froze. And as you said in the intro, Carolyn, I've interviewed some of my role models and favorite celebrities, Walter Cronkite, Peter Jennings, Lady Bird Johnson, Willie Nelson. To quote Ted Koppel, a journalist I admire and once interviewed, he said, "Many of us choose journalism as a career because it allows us to remain adolescents past the age of 40. Our work is endlessly interesting because we are moving from one story to the next. We are free to hold others to much higher standards than we are inclined to meet ourselves, and in exchange for all of this, our egos are regularly massaged and we are paid much more than we're worth." So it was a great gig, but I decided, as I mentioned, to leave commercial television 5 years ago. I chose to retire from the anchor desk because I had some very deep philosophical differences with the broadcasting giant Sinclair Broadcasting, who purchased KITV where I was anchoring. And also, after working nights for 30 years and being on call 24/7, I think my husband was ready for Friday night dates. And this is the honest to God truth, in all my years in TV, 33 years, I had never been to a happy hour because I was always working during the week. So when I first retired, somebody said, "What's Judy doing these days?" And he said, "Day drinking." Not true. But really, in the fickle, frantic world of television news, I was fortunate to leave on my own terms with no regrets. I'm grateful I worked in the golden era of television news when the nightly newscast was really appointment television. We all sat down in front of the TV at 6 o'clock to find out what was going on. I was shown incredible awards and accolades when I stepped off the anchor desk. In fact, a few weeks after I left, I took this big newspaper article that was on the front page of Metro State and the Statesman, and it had like half a dozen color pictures of me and the whole bit, Maggio to sign off for the final time. And I took it to a frame store, and I'm telling the guy how are we going to fit all this great stuff on one frame, feeling pretty special, like I'm a local celebrity. So it came time to pay for this frame that was going to capture my career. And the guy looked at me and he goes, "Well, the first thing I need to know is, what's your name?" It's kind of humbling. After I stepped off the anchor desk, I ran a small media consulting business and did freelance video projects, did a lot of video work for the St. David's Foundation, which I really believe in. They do so many good works in this community for local nonprofits. But I realized I really wasn't ready to retire, that there were so many stories I still wanted to tell about this community. And in 2016, I got a phone call from KLRU, asking if I knew anyone who would like to come start a news and public affairs department at this local TV station, PBS, KLRU. And I said, "Yeah, I know somebody, me." So in 2017, I unretired. We launched Decibel. I like to call it Frontline meets Facebook. We premiere a lot of our stories on Facebook. We're a small news team. There are just 2 photographers/reporters, myself and a social media producer. We try to cover real issues, real people, real things that matter. And we've scored some amazing interviews in our short time as a team, and I wanted to just give you a little taste of some of the things that we do. We do a lot of live Facebook coverage, and here's some of the interviews that we've done.
History is our greatest teacher, and that means it's not about the past. We can't change the past. There's nothing we do studying history that will change what happened in the Battle of Gettysburg or in the Tet Offensive, but we study it to understand ourselves now.
We see literally there are millions of women in this country who are lacking access to care simply because of the attacks on women's health.
I do think it's also a tough time to be a journalist. I mean, you know, we are being attacked constantly by the president, by his supporters, by conservative media, etc. So, you know, my only advice to people who are thinking about doing it is come in, it's great, it's a wonderful profession, make sure you get your facts straight, and you need to have a thick skin. You need to be tough.
I want to make sure that people understand that Code Next is not going to make the city of Austin income accessible for people.
But I like modern Austin a lot. You know, I'm not going to be one of those old school ones saying, oh, like, you know, because it was pretty quiet. I moved here in the 80s and there wasn't much going on.
Say, give us your best Girl Scout pitch, okay? On the count of 3, you ready? 1, 2, 3.
Would you like to buy some Girl Scout cookies?
Who needs more than that?
Kind of having a good time in this new gig. You can tell. My most recent big interview was 2 weeks ago with another one of my role models, Stan Rather. We sat down to talk about his newest project, and I don't know if you heard about this, but it premiered at South by Southwest, and it's a fascinating documentary called Human Nature. It explores the pros and cons of CRISPR, which is really gene splicing. And there's so many different ethical questions around being able to decide whether your baby's going to be 6 feet tall and have blue eyes. But then there's some very, positive things about it, like its progress in stopping sickle cell anemia. So just the pros and cons of that. He is 88 years old, still doing the work he loves and telling important stories. So again, another role model. Decibel is not just on Facebook, it's also a monthly broadcast on KLRU. And as I mentioned, we take a hard look at community issues and then try to share some potential solutions. So each month we take on a different topic, everything from homelessness to immigration to mental health. Last month our focus was aging in Austin. I don't know if you know, but Austin has the fastest growing population of people 65 plus in the country. So this isn't just a place for youngsters. It's also a place that needs to engage people that are 55 and beyond. This month, we're tackling Austin's racial divide. You probably know that despite the fact that we say we're a very progressive, welcoming, open city, we're the only major metropolitan area with a dwindling African American population. So this month, we're looking at everything from the growing racial wealth gap and how it's kind of rooted in systemic racism. I sat down with Wilhelmina Delka. We did a lengthy interview about kind of the history of East Austin, and we did a story on why the tech industry has so much trouble being diverse. So to put in a little plug, that Decibel broadcast will be Friday night, the 29th at 7:30, and then it'll rerun again at Saturday and Sunday at 6 o'clock on KLRU. So I've never been more proud of my work. In 37 years of working in television, I finally won an Emmy Award last year. So excited. You saw Ken Burns. It was for a half-hour local documentary that our team put together to run in conjunction with the Ken Burns Vietnam documentary. Some of you saw that on PBS. It's so well done. So we did a short local version of that. We talked to local veterans, protesters, South Vietnamese refugees. And I thought I would show you a clip from that Emmy Award-winning broadcast to show you the type of work that we do. This particular clip is on PTSD. It involves twin brothers who both served in Vietnam.
2 months prior to leaving Vietnam, I knew I was different. I knew that I was not Donnie anymore. I was, Sergeant Darcy. You can't unlearn the stuff that you learn in combat. If you have any kind of a moral compass, there's some things that you're going to have to deal with. Things you see, things you hear, things you smell. All of those things come back. I mean, to this day, I know when a body's dead. When I'm around a dead body, I do know it.
Don Dorsey left Vietnam more than 40 years ago, but it never left him.
The war ended for me when I left. The peace is a problem. The end of the war didn't affect the war that was going on inside me.
Sometimes the passage of time alone just isn't enough to erase the emotional pain of war. About a third of all Vietnam veterans suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. The horrors they witnessed or endured in Vietnam still haunt them today.
Guys, they're raised on Superman and Batman and all of these superheroes, and there's never any collateral damage. If innocent people don't die. And not only that, they never do the wrong thing. And here you are in Vietnam, and innocent people are dying all around you, your friends and the Vietnamese. And what exactly you're doing, it isn't clear that it's good. And maybe you come to the conclusion that actually is bad.
While PTSD is now a common diagnosis for returning veterans, it wasn't identified or even talked about in the Vietnam era. Many veterans came home and stayed silent about their trauma for years. Maggie Rivas Rodriguez has interviewed hundreds of Latino veterans for an oral history project called Voces.
There was no notion of you come back and you are a different person. Over and over again we hear, I left Vietnam in the morning. It was sweltering heat. I was in Vietnam, and within 24 hours, I was back home, and I was supposed to just pick up and carry on like I had been before. And they had changed.
I saw some changes in me that I didn't like. I wasn't cruel or mean, but I just didn't care about a lot. I was dead in my head. My emotions were gone. I died too many times in Vietnam, and so I just stayed dead.
The symptoms of PTSD may take months, years, or even decades to surface, but they should never be ignored.
I was in such a depressive mood that I would just involuntarily cry, but tears would just start streaming down my eyes. And I would try to ignore it, but it just wouldn't stop.
I'd stay in my room. I'd nobody to talk to. When I would go out, I'd drink too much and get in fights. I would cry for no reason. I didn't understand it at all.
So I went through a lot of different changes in my life until I finally heard about PTSD, and I put it all together. And I went to the VA, and I told them, I said, hey, I think I got this thing, PTSD.
Both Towery and Dorsey have found help and healing through therapy and support groups. They now spend much of their time helping other veterans and veterans' causes. It's work that's providing a new purpose in their lives.
I've got to make my time here count for something, which is why I'm involved with veterans. I have to have a purpose for being alive. I lost some good friends that didn't have that opportunity. It's what keeps me alive. I'm nobody's hero. I just have to do this to stay alive.
Got a great team. I can't really take credit for any of the stories that we do because they're brilliant photographers and editors, and I'm really so proud of my work. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm getting to do stories that I could never do in commercial TV because we just didn't have the time and the resources to do them. We had a 5, 6, and 10 o'clock newscast every night. There's some wonderful journalists still working in local television. So now I want to look ahead to where we might be headed in the journalism world. The move is obviously away from broadcasting into the news being presented on many different social media platforms in many different ways. Many people, especially those under the age of 40, don't seek out news in traditional ways. We all know that. It's more like incidental exposure, and I see that kind of as a double-edged sword. Here's why. On one hand, it is driving people to more diverse sources of information, which on the surface seems like a good thing. Because I don't believe anybody should get their news in a bubble, where ideas and attitudes are reinforced, rather than different perspectives being explored and respected. On the other hand, the sources of information need to be legitimate and trustworthy. And as we've all learned in the past few years, misinformation is running rampant on social media platforms. This recent study really disturbed me. It came from the Columbian Journalism Review. It revealed that 60% of people believe that reporters get paid by their sources, either sometimes or very often. Think about that. 60% of people have that misconception. No reputable news organization pays sources, yet more than half the people polled in the country think so. That's troubling. And it is really no wonder that for-profit journalism is having trouble making profits, and the business models are always being challenged. When I started in TV news in 1981, there were nights our 10 p.m. newscast had a 40% share of the audience in Austin, Texas. That's remarkable. An advertiser's dream, right? Now a late local newscast is lucky to get 8 or 9%. So the advertising dollars, the slice of the pie, has been cut thinner and thinner and thinner. That's why so much of the news now is driven towards websites, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, news alerts. It makes sense because that's where everybody's looking for news, on their phone or on their computer. I do think that one vital place for news of the future, though, is nonprofit. The nonprofit model seemed to be working. I'm talking about the Texas Tribune, KUT, To Toot Our Own Horn, KLRU. In many of these groups, we started collaborating together to cover issues. And I think you will see a lot more of that in the future. And I want to say that we have some exciting opportunities ahead at KLRU locally to use the power of the media for the public good. After 55 years as tenants at the University of Texas, KLRU is actually moving off campus. That means I probably won't hit a scooter driver, because I feel like I'm going to hit a scooter sometime. When you work on campus, those scooters just pop right out in front of you. Starting in 2021, we are joining forces with Austin Community College. And we are moving to a brand new facility under construction right now at the old Dillard's at Highland Mall. So I like to tell people that my new office is in the women's department at Dillard's. Our future home will be a 45,000 square foot Austin Media Center at ACC Highland. And since it's brand new, the world's at our feet. We can go beyond just retooling for the changing landscape of what broadcasting may mean in the future, and make KLRU more visible, accessible, and flexible. So I'm really personally excited about these possibilities. They may never get rid of me. I may never retire. We're going to make it almost like a public square for Central Texas, where people can come and share ideas and discuss issues in our community. So that's my big news for today, but I always like to end my presentation with a call to action. And before I start taking questions, here is my call to action for all of you today. Think about where and how you get your news, and try to get out of your comfort zone from time to time. We all gravitate towards news that validates our belief systems, right? I'm guilty of it. I listen to NPR endlessly. I read the New York Times, the Washington Post, and of course the local newspaper. But I have to make a conscious effort from time to time to listen and read viewpoints that may not reflect my own. We live in such a divided time in this country, and I believe that the more we listen to one another with open minds and open hearts, and truly try to understand where other people with different viewpoints are coming from, this will make for a healthier democracy. And good, solid journalism, truth-telling, is vital to a healthy democracy. So thanks for letting me share my thoughts today and telling my truth, and I'm happy to stick around and hear what questions you all may have today. Thank you. Thanks.
So your last comment, fragility of a democracy or the strength of a democracy, and the kind of news we're getting, the kind of information that's being put out, so much of which is blatantly wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not true, it's intended to be
influencing.
It's inflammatory.
Yeah, inflammatory and influencing, yeah.
And so I'd like you to, if you would, comment on that kind of inflammatory information, pervasive information that people believe. I mean, they believe this is true, and it pits people against each other just because they're a Christian or a Democrat or Jewish or Muslim or whatever. They're pitted against each other. Thank you.
I find it heartbreaking personally because I've spent a career in this profession and I've always tried and strived to tell both sides of a story and to get to the truth of an issue. So when people pretend to be a journalist, pundits go on TV and say things that are purely propaganda, and put things out over social media, it breaks my heart. And the whole idea of people thinking about fake news coming from reliable, solid journalists, I do think is threatening to our democracy. I don't know what the answer is. I just encourage people to try to make sure that the source of their information is a valid source. Just like a journalist would make sure the source of information telling a story was valid. You know, when I started in TV, before we went on the news with a breaking story, we validated it with 3 sources. In this age of Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, sometimes there's this rush to get the information out there, and sometimes it's just wrong. And I don't have an answer as far as how we can move forward from this particular time and place. But I think the more people speak up against false news and propaganda and label it what it is, the better we will all be.
What I have observed is that we have a new concept of what news is today.
Mm-hmm.
Many people think Sean Hannity dispenses news. He dispenses opinion. And with so many people giving their opinion on various forms of social media, we just don't have anything anymore that is well defined as news.
Yeah.
Do you have an answer for that?
I still love the tactile feeling of holding a newspaper in my hand with a cup of coffee and reading it front to back. I'm a big believer in newspapers, and I know that newspapers are going through a much bigger identity crisis than television stations are, because the very way they deliver their stories has had to be totally reinvented. I think the answer to your question is much like what we discussed, before, in that those sources of news have to be vetted. And I don't know how we can stop people like Sean Hannity or, God forbid, Alex Jones from getting a following and having people think what they say is the truth. One of my most gut-wrenching moments in my career was holding a panel discussion with some of the parents of Sandy Hook. Some of the parents had lost their children in that shooting. And when Alex Jones came on TV and on his show and said that was all fabricated, I started crying. I met those parents. I saw the pain in their eyes. I wish I had, some more insight into how we can delineate the propaganda from the truth-telling. I think it's going to take all of us calling out when we see propaganda and making sure people in our feed know this isn't true, or that our colleagues know. It's kind of, I've been doing a lot of studying about racism, and one of the problems is nobody wants to be uncomfortable. Nobody wants to talk about racism when they see it happening, whether it's a bad joke or no diversity on a board that you serve on. I think that we all need to get out of our comfort zone and call out the propaganda that's posing as news, because it's not news. But I don't know if there's a blanket way we can, get rid of this stuff, because I think it's going to be here to stay for a while. I worry about future generations of journalists, and how they are going to be taught and led and feel that calling to be objective and to tell both sides of a story, when indeed so much of what we see on the air and what we listen to and read is not both sides of a story. So I don't know if that answered your question or not, but thank you for what you have done in journalism.
Thank you. My name is Susan Meredith, and I just want to comment on that. One thing that I think is that if the real news, there's a journalism, association or something, if there was a, thing that said...
A stamp of approval?
Yeah.
That's a good idea.
Then we can identify what real news is. If there was a way to get that, everybody that does that. But anyway, that's not my question. I was just...
No, but I like that concept. I don't
Yeah.
know, so who would it would be difficult to figure out who the decision makers would be to give that stamp of approval.
Aren't you in an association?
Well, there's many different journalism associations. Anyway. But I think that's a great idea. And I do think the network news, and I didn't say this earlier, I do feel like CBS and ABC and NBC do a pretty darn good job telling both sides of the story still, and doing quality journalism. I think the CBS Sunday Morning program is terrific. I watch that every Sunday, and there's some in 60 Minutes. There's still some great journalism out there. So
yeah. It's just if a show you could tell this is news, this is not.
Yes, I know.
Anyway,
but you want to like a blinking light. This is not news.
Yeah, right. Or this is. Either way. My question really, I can probably tell by my hat, I'm more environmental oriented. I don't know if you can read it from there. It says, "Make Mother Earth Great Again."
I like your hat.
Yeah, and that's my passion is that. And I just wondered if you're doing anything around the environment that's coming up.
Well, funny that you should ask. Next month, our focus is on water. And where we're going as a community in trying to make sure we have a clean, safe water supply, how we ended up with the boil water notice. We're not doing the big environmental picture, but we will eventually do a big focus on climate change and the environment. There's a wonderful professor at UT named Jay Banner. I don't know if any of you have ever seen any of his programs, but yeah, he really makes environmental science accessible. And we're going to be talking to him about water, and eventually I'm sure we'll do some more things on the environment. But in April, water is our focus.
So one of the traditional ways we were told to get the truth is by diversifying our sources.
Right.
But that assumed that there was some legitimacy to the various sources. And you several times have referred to both sides of the story. Mm-hmm. But isn't it true that it's rarely just two sides to a story?
Yes.
Usually there are multiple sides, if you can even call them sides, and it's almost impossible for an audience member to even understand what those are unless the media present things in less of a sort of black and white or right and left kind of perspective.
Yeah.
And when you have the major news stations that you referred to, or networks that you referred to, and then Fox News, alleged so-called news, as the counter to something or other, if it becomes the counter to the major networks, then that confuses things even further.
Yeah,
so
right.
I wonder if there is, I mean, we do have PolitiFact kind of investigations occasionally on a few topics, but beyond that, and when we have a president who, the Washington Post's running total is over 9,000 lies and misstatements since he took office, can you be a little more specific about how we can kind of defend ourselves and defend the truth?
Well, again, I think it's often the sources, and I know PBS NewsHour. I try to watch that. I'm working for a PBS station, but I think that PBS NewsHour does a great job going more in depth, and will bring in people from
viewpoints on a particular topic. And I think that's why I was talking about nonprofit journalism. I think that we have the time and the ability to look at things through many different lenses. But you're absolutely right. When there is an entire network that, for the most part, is delivering news through through a Republican right-leaning lens, I would say the same thing about MSNBC, though. I think that MSNBC tends to reflect everything through a left-leaning lens. I try not to watch either one of those channels just because I feel like my news is being filtered. But I don't have, as far as, you're right, we can't always tell both sides of a story. And sometimes both sides of a story don't need to be told. Sometimes the story is just there. And you don't need to bring in a variety of people. When you're talking about a weather event or a murder. But you're right. It has become more and more difficult for journalists to remain objective in the face of falsehoods. And I hope that our profession is doing a decent job calling out those falsehoods. I think the Washington Post and the New York Times do a tremendous job, especially the Post. And when those falsehoods come from either side, calling it out. The point is that, we need tools to seek out where we get our news and know that we're getting it not through a filter. I think a little research. Research the places that you get your news. See how they're rated. The Poynter Institute, the Knight Foundation, these journalism, there's so many different ways you can actually look up, the truthfulness factor in various news organizations. And I would highly recommend the Poynter Institute is great for that. Like I said, the Knight Foundation, there's several more, but those organizations really do hold journalists' feet to the fire, and that would be one way that you could check out your particular source of news. Did that answer it a little bit better? Okay, all right. Yes, we got in the back.
Hi, my name is Bobby.
Hi, Bobby.
Many sides to the story. The alternative press, I wanted to put in a word for The Nation, Mother Jones, Ms. Magazine,
the Austin
Chronicle. You took the words out of my mouth. The Observer.
The Texas Observer.
My father was born in the former century, came over as a young man in 1912 and learned English from reading at least 6 or 7 New York newspapers. And so that was my influence too. And then there's something to be said for the multiculturalism of all of that, and filtering and discerning from many sources, and there are many more. Thanks.
Yeah, the New Yorker also does some great in-depth pieces. You're getting a workout today, Caroline.
Thanks for coming. I just was wondering, what would your recommendation be for someone wanting to start a career in journalism now, coming out of high school or coming out of college, and getting them on the right path so they could have a long and steady career?
I think that for the most part, the universities are doing a great job. The University of Missouri has a wonderful journalism program. I think the University of Texas has a great journalism program. So does Texas State. We get a lot of the interns, and they're in it for, most of the young people are in it for all the right reasons. So my advice would be, though, to get as much experience as possible before trying to get a job. The reason I was hired at KVU back in 1981, right out of college, was that I had done several internships, including an internship at the state capitol for WFAA TV. This was back in the days when the major newspapers and TV stations had bureaus in the state capitol. Which led to some very interesting stories late at night. But that's what I would suggest is doing that work for free and getting your feet wet that way.
before trying to find a paid position. Also writing, just finding some blog sites that you'd like to work with, and perhaps doing some writing about things that stories that you're passionate about. Let's face it, everybody can tell a story these days with YouTube. And again, a double-edged sword. Some of the stories are not true, but there's a lot of avenues for young journalists today to do their work. I don't think it's a terrible time to be a journalist like some people do. I think that I'm hopeful. Judging from the young interns that we get, I'm very hopeful about the future of the profession.
Thanks again for coming, Judy. Two things. Washington Week in Review. Mm-hmm. I keep waiting for Latinos to be part of the journalists giving opinions, and not necessarily just about immigration or how bad it is, not voting. What is PBS doing to have a more diverse group on panel shows like that? I know that it's started to do some African American and other
Well, the late
folks.
Gwen Ifill was so wonderful.
Yes.
But you're right. You are absolutely right. And I noticed that too it's not just PBS. There are a lot of the national broadcasts that have African Americans and whites, but the Latino voice needs to be heard because it's the fastest growing group in our country. So I will be happy to pass that along to my PBS cohorts at the national level and let them know that. I hadn't thought about Washington Week in Review, but you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
Last one.
Yes.
With all the tech companies here and the need to support public TV, are they being part of the supporters with funding of the programs?
Yes. In fact, I'm not in the development part of our business, nor should I ever be, because that's something totally separate. And it's been a real learning curve for me to work for a nonprofit after working in commercial TV. My husband and I always say, well, our kids are through with college and our house is paid for, so now I can work for nonprofits. But I don't know anything about the fundraising arm of what we do. I can only speak to our mission. But I can tell you that Silicon Labs has been a huge supporter of KLRU. And Tyson Tuttle is on our board, was president of our board. And so I know that they are very supportive of public television. And I think several of the tech companies have been incredibly supportive of PBS because, we are community supported. We can't exist unless we have monetary support from the community. And I did want to add one more thing. The president has, once again, in the new budget, proposed cutting out the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, but everyone is very confident that that will not happen again like it did 2 years ago because we have so many ardent supporters on both sides of the aisle on Capitol Hill. So we feel very comfortable about that. Yeah.
So I have a question. It's kind of a two-part question. The first part is, I guess, a challenge in journalism now because so many people who pass themselves off as journalists don't really have any training in journalism. Mm-hmm. So they haven't really been taught any sense of journalism ethics. Mm-hmm. Anybody can post a blog and people read it and think this is done by somebody who has some professional training. But I also know that when you go to journalism school, one of the things you do learn, and you've touched on this, is to kind of do fair, balanced news, is to cover both sides of a story. It seems like one of the dangers that we've had with trying to do both sidism, they call it, is the danger of false equivalencies.
I think
Thinking
you're right.
if you've got to do a critical story of this person, then you've got to come up with something that's critical of the other, and they're not really kind of equal.
Yeah.
So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I think that that goes to being a good investigative reporter and making sure that the sources that you're using are valid sources. And as I said earlier, if there is something in a story that is not there's just so many stories where that's not needed, as you said. But yeah, the false equivalency issue has come to play, especially during the Trump administration, because people felt like there are journalists who felt like, well, we're just, slamming the president and, he's saying these things, so we need to hear from the other side. But at the same time, our job as journalists is to hold politicians' feet to the fire. I mean, these people work for us. So when there's a blatant falsehood, there really isn't an equivalency to that. I mean, you have to call it out. So that is definitely an exception to the whole idea of being objective. And I think sometimes our objectivity has gotten us in trouble. I mean, I think that sometimes you do have to call people in power to the carpet and say that this is not right, this is not true. And this is lessons I'm learning even at my age, because it's so ingrained in me to be objective, and I never want people, as I said at the beginning, to know my politics or my faith, because they think that I'm tilting my stories one way or another because those are my personal belief systems. So I think more important than anything is not necessarily the two sides of the story, is that not to interject your personal belief systems and seek out the truth. And that probably is a much better way to state it than two sides of a story.
Hi, Ed Underhill. Is there a Bitcoin market, and if so, what is it? And if what I understand is true, doesn't that change the game entirely for everybody with respect to everything?
I don't understand Bitcoins. I'm going to fall on my sword here and just tell you that the whole currency situation that's technologically based, I don't get it. I barely have trouble playing my videos on the laptop. So I would not be the person to ask about Bitcoins.
Thank you. It's a great conversation. Do you think that people in general are reading things with less depth than they used to?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I know you read the Washington Post and the New York Times and all, but I think fewer people do. And what do you think about that?
I think so, because, our habits have changed. To sit down and watch an hour-long broadcast of 60 Minutes, for example, takes time out of our busy lives. So I think that people are scrolling through and they see a headline that catches their eye, and it may be a headline that has nothing to do with the story, it just wants to catch your eye, or it may be a story that's really not that important, but it sounds interesting. And that's why I still like the old-fashioned newspaper, because I feel like I'm getting this broad scope. And even when I read it online, I feel like I'm editing a little bit, But when I have it in front of me, I kind of have to read it all because it's there in black and white. But I do worry about everybody's getting their news online and not getting the depth of the stories. I think that's a great point. It's a great point.
So I get to ask you another question.
Okay. You guys are making me think this morning. I should have had a cup more coffee.
But first, an observation. Most of the conversation here has been about fake news and lies and the President of the United States lying 9,000 times or more. Maybe there's a story there. And since you do kind of independent news, you opened with 60% of the people believe that sources are paid. Maybe there's a breakthrough story there that somebody could do about fake news and truth and the American way and how we're changed by all that. So,
I like that idea, and in fact, we've discussed holding a town hall meeting on that very thing at KLRU and bring in a lot of the professors, the First Amendment experts, the journalism professors. Dan Rather calls Austin home, and we had a long discussion about this very topic when I interviewed him. So I think that's a really good idea, because nobody's really shining the light on that as much as they should. They talk about it, the New York, I think it's the Washington Post, because the New York Times says democracy dies in darkness. Is that the New York Times? Yeah. But maybe a half-hour investigative special on where are we with the First Amendment? Where are we with freedom of the press? And how can we ensure that future generations get accurate, truth-telling news?
Where are we with truth and democracy?
Yeah.
But my question was, you said earlier that things have changed. People don't look at the 6 o'clock or the 10 o'clock news like we used to. can you talk a little bit more about that cultural mega shift and what that new shift looks like in terms of the people that are under 40 and how they...
I wish I had some statistics with me, but I think that for the most part, the last thing I read was something like people over the age of 50 get about 40% of their news from TV, but people, like traditional TV broadcasts, but I think people under the age of 50 only get like 25%. But yeah, so if you watch local news, you'll see how we're still say we, but commercial news, you'll see that so many things are going to the website. We did this interview, but if you want to see the whole thing, watch our website. Or, we're breaking this on Twitter, but if you want to see more, watch our newscast. So it's like, it's cross-pollination, cross-promotion, and they're doing a lot more of that now because they know that stories break on Twitter. So they have to put the news out there on Twitter. Hopefully they've sourced it and it's researched before they do. And then they send them to the broadcast. And then just like, we're constantly learning how to do this. I mean, I find Facebook to be a very flawed platform for a lot of different reasons, but when I was hired, they said, let's be Facebook first. So now we're learning that maybe Facebook is not the best place to premiere our stories. We're looking at trying to build our YouTube channel. So it's just a constant evaluation. But as far as the disparity, there's definitely an age disparity in sourcing of news. Older people do tend to go to the more traditional ones, and people under 50, and especially under 40. I mean, most millennials don't really own a TV. My daughter's 27, she doesn't own a TV. She watches everything online. So.
Hi, I'm Dale Beulah. Thank you for being here. We talk about two sides of a story or multiple sides. Mm-hmm. What's the other side of the theory of gravity? I mean, there are some issues.
You're absolutely right.
And I'm thinking of wildfires, floods, tornadoes, things that have never occurred before, and no one mentions the word climate issues, or that 9 of the 10 warmest years have happened in the last decade. It's like, well, we don't want to mention that because then the other side of the story is that there's no such thing. Is there a Democratic and Republican thermometer? I mean, to me, a thermometer is a thermometer.
I do think that more people are understanding now that and I hate to say it, it's because we're having these massive events like wildfires and tsunamis, or people are dying. They're finally coming to terms with the fact that climate change is real. And I think the news broadcasters have done a better job. I mean, we don't typically, at KLRU, we don't typically cover breaking news stories and things like that because we don't have a newscast. I mean, we take an issue and do a 30-minute special on that. But I think that would go back to the environmental piece of doing something like a half-hour special on, the realities of climate change in our world. But I think you're right. There aren't two sides to, and I mentioned that earlier, you can't have two sides of a breaking news story when it comes to a fire or a flood. But I do think that journalists have been remiss at times to not bring in a scientist and talk to them about why this is occurring. A lot of the TV stations have trained meteorologists on their staffs, and I think that helps, and the meteorologists can put it into more scientific terms. But I think that we have a tendency, especially in commercial TV, to dumb down the news, especially in Austin, where we have so many college-educated people. You're right. I mean, my brother and sister are both scientists, and they always say, journalists know nothing about science. They never report science. They don't ever put things into perspective from a scientific viewpoint. So I think that's a valid criticism.
All right, we have time for one more question.
Howdy, how you doing?
Hi, I'm fine.
Hi, I remember when you started. My name's R.T. Kearsley. People know me as Rich also. Just want to qualify myself so that I don't look like an audience plant. I'm a veteran of, I used to work at KXAN. I ended up working in New York for
wonderful.
NBC News and for Fox News and for
Wonderful.
Fox
So,
as an engineer and also as a reporter.
Oh, wow.
Well,
Okay.
I flew in Chopper 4 and Chopper 5 in New York.
So you were trained in journalism in
No, I was
in the
trained in
military?
electrical engineering, actually,
Okay,
but
okay.
I stumbled into this. But my question is...
You should be up here answering these hard questions.
No, thank you very much. I appreciate that, and I'm really glad that you're here. The thing that I am asking is, and that I constantly ask myself, is in the face of the present 21st century paradigm of our desensitization to extremely aberrant behaviors socially, morally, and this and that from our elected officials, business leaders, and all of these other people who are the headliners and newsmakers, how do you see the future of journalism, quote unquote, as opposed to infotainment in the United States and the world at large, and how that will evolve, and what is in danger, what are we in danger of losing through that process? Thank you.
Good question. I don't see entertainment news and people posing as real journalists going away because there's money to be made. And it always goes down to the bottom line, doesn't it? It always goes down to the money. I am hopeful. I tend to be a glass half full person. I am hopeful that the right type of journalism will eventually prevail. But I don't see, I think that they're going to have to coexist. I don't think that the propaganda and the pundits posing as journalists will go away. Did that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, we have about 2 minutes left if you just want to make a summary statement of some sort.
Well, I just appreciate you guys giving all of this thought. You've made me think this morning, and I appreciate that very much because most of the time when I give these talks, people just raise their hand and go, "Great job, thanks for doing this." And you have made me think this morning, and I really appreciate that because this is an ever-evolving profession, and I realized when I left that it's my calling and my passion. And I hope that you will watch what we're doing at KLRU, and I hope you'll tell me what you think about it, good or bad. Carolyn, Tomas, everybody knows how to reach me. Feel free to suggest story ideas, and feel free to critique and criticize and say, hey, you know, if you're on Facebook, watch our Facebook interviews, watch our Facebook stories. Let me know what you think. As I mentioned, we depend on the community to do our jobs. All of you are the ones we depend on to know what's going on in our community. I don't want to just get a news release and say something's happening. I want to know from the people that it impacts. So I hope that you will watch Decibel, that you'll feel comfortable calling me out when I'm wrong, and also calling in story ideas to me from time to time and let me know what you think. So thanks for having me.
Thank you very much, Ms. Maggio.